Press College Roundtable edition, where we give college journalists from across the country the opportunity to ask questions they want answers to from newsmakers that they want to hear from. This week, we've seen institutions start to respond to demands for change, while in other areas, citizens are taking matters into their own hands. Mayors across the country are grappling with local-level challenges of keeping citizens safe during a health crisis and public protests, while also debating how to reform policing dramatically. My guest this week is Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto. And asking the questions are student journalists. First up is Sarah Beth Guevara. She's a grad student at the University of Oklahoma, where she covers politics and law. Sarah Beth, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I got into journalism after my family became a foster family to a girl whose parents were deported to Mexico. And I realized that nobody will make a change that I want for my big sister until people start to care.
Next up is David Wolf-Bender. He is a rising freshman at the University of Indiana, and he's been covering the growth of community policing for public radio in Indianapolis. David, tell us a little something about yourself.
Yeah, I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's a very racially segregated city, unfortunately. Most of the local stories I actually covered for WFYI News when I was working for that public radio station in Indianapolis, were actually about policy changes, policy initiative, and shifts between the city's minority populations and the police force in the city.
Very good. And finally, Avalon Pernell. She is a rising junior at Washington and Lee University in the state of Virginia, where she's a news editor at the college newspaper, The Ring-Tumfi. Avalon, tell us a little bit about your latest coverage.
Thanks, Chuck. As a journalist at a Southern college, one topic I'm covering is the impact of long-held traditions on students today, who may not fit the mold of a typical W&L student. For example, we covered the circulation of a petition from students who did not feel comfortable with having the portrait of a Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, on their diplomas and wanted the option to opt out.
Very interesting. I have a feeling I'll be very curious to see if the name Lee is still associated with that university before this decade ends. But David, the first question goes to you.
Yeah, so Mr. Mayor, I want to go back to 2016. David Brown, who back then was a Dallas police chief, and he heads the Chicago Police Department. He said this, he said, quote, "We are asking cops to do too much in this country. We are. Every societal failure, we put it off on the cops to solve." He went on to name mental health, drug prevention as two specific areas that we have passed on to cops or passed on to the police. Two-part question. Do you agree with David Brown's assessment? And if so, do you support increased funding in other areas to lessen the burden on police?
It's a great way of talking about a very controversial issue. Right now, there's so much raw emotion around what is being discussed as defunding the police. There's a lot of questions of what should policing look like in the 21st century. I agree 100% with what the police chief said. And we see it even more today, where homelessness, addiction, mental health issues are at the forefront of every city's agenda. If we only use police in order to try to solve those problems, then we're doing a disservice not only to the police, but the people we serve.
So you say you do support increased funding. Where do you plan to have that money come from? I guess, do you support taking some of the police's budget to support those issues at a city level?
Well, there's a dilemma here, because at the same time, cities around the United States are facing a budget deficit due to the coronavirus. Our revenue streams have been cut. We're in a city like Pittsburgh, where we anticipate a 20% reduction from last year's revenue. Finding the revenue needed in order to provide additional services to our constituents that don't necessarily have to be done by a police officer requires partnership. And those partnerships begin with the philanthropic community, but they become also a part of the corporate community, the nonprofit community, and the city's resources as well.
Sarah Beth, you have the next question.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor, Allegheny County is 13% black. 30% of your black population lives below the poverty line. Your state also leads the nation in highest average student debt per borrower. So how do you plan on adequately preparing black high school students to pay for colleges, especially with the additional financial burdens caused by COVID-19?
Well, again, it goes where I said before. There have to be creative partnerships that are created in the city of Pittsburgh. We've created a partnership with our largest employer, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. UPMC has contributed to a scholarship fund where each student graduating with a 2.0 grade point average from Pittsburgh Public Schools is guaranteed a $5,000 per semester scholarship for college. Obviously, the cost of education is much more than that, but that is adequate in order to be able to, within our community college system, in order to get the first 2 years paid for, and then assist if they're looking at going to another university later.
So I looked into this, and the most affordable higher education in your area is the Community College of Allegheny County, which has a 14% Black enrollment rate. Your two largest universities in the area is Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, which has a 3% and 5% Black enrollment rate, respectively. You've mentioned all of these programs that you're doing to try to close that gap between the community college and these higher levels of education. So where is the failing?
Where is the failing? Well, CMU and Carnegie Mellon are much more global than the other institutions. There's 7 universities within the city of Pittsburgh, or the immediate area of a few miles right outside. Carnegie Mellon in particular has a very large global population. The University of Pittsburgh has a very strong national. Those two schools are probably on the outlier of the numbers. And I'm not saying that we can't do better and that we should not be doing more. But again, I think that a lot of the areas that we see where this failure is occurring is we're not preparing our students within the city to take the path of a college education. And that happens before their senior year. That happens very early on. Another program that we just started in partnership with Dolly Parton Foundation. Every Pittsburgher who is born is now given a library, a book a month for the first 5 years of your life, 60 books in all, in order to be able to bring that vocabulary into a child's life at a very, right from the beginning of life.
Avalon, you have the next question. Go for it.
Thank you. Thanks again, Mr. Mayor, for coming on. Last Thursday, you proposed more reforms to police use of force policies in the wake of George Floyd's death while in police custody. But some controversial tactics like the chokehold were already banned in Pittsburgh. Since this is a problem of application, how do you plan to enforce rules that may already be in place?
Well, out of the 8 Can't Wait campaign, there were 4 that the campaign identified that Pittsburgh Pittsburgh had already instituted. Out of the 8, having our police look through it, they said that we're doing all 8. But there's a reason that we're not getting credit for the other 4, and that's simply due to how we're using it through training, how we're using it through a consistent policy, and whether we're making it part of a city code or just a policy of the police bureau. So it's not enough simply to have these as policies of a police bureau. They need to be embedded into the very fabric and the code of a city, and they need to be on a continual practice, not simply when you're a cadet going through an academy, but on a continual practice. You have to have training in order to be able to keep that fresh. With those, we view those as just the foundation. Those will, according to the people who have created that campaign, reduce the number of deaths by 72% if those 8 actions are taken. Now, getting beyond that is where the true functions of reform need to be looked at. As we talked about before, What is the authority of a police officer? Can others be able to help people better and be able to lessen the likelihood of somebody getting into a cycle that will lead them to crime?
The vice president of the Pittsburgh Fraternal Order of Police voiced concerns in a letter over politicians' lack of support for the police. How do you plan to get the police union specifically on board for further reforms?
I was on the receiving end of one of those letters, and basically, where the emotional level is right now, we're all, and I don't mean that as elected officials, just all of us as a nation are in a fight or flight mode. And when you're in that type of a mode, long-term rational thought is not always at the forefront. I think that if the police union start to look at this as a way of understanding that the societal needs in urban areas today are much different than they were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago, that the makeup of cities are very progressive, and that the people that live within those cities want to see the societal change within policing. Then we'll start to see there are opportunities where certain functions that they have been asked to do in the past will be better served by others, and where their operations will be redefined through tactical deployment, training, and the use of force for the future. So to be a part of that discussion requires being a partner in recognizing that that change is inevitable, that we are at a point now in this country where it is going to occur. And would you like to be a part of that discussion of how it occurs, or would you rather protest it and try and stop? The train's already left the station. There is no going back at this point. And it's only a question of what that reform will end up looking like for cities all across this country.
Mayor Bill Peduto, you've, to me, given us an excellent example of how complicated all of this is going to be, that you may be able to have a good headline of where reform is headed, but this is going to be complicated. Every city is a bit different. Every one of these reform debates is going to be very different. And so I thought this was an excellent example. And as you can see, these journalists asked you some tough questions as well, but in the right spirit of all of it, in surfacing these tough issues that all of us have to grapple with right now. So, Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you for joining the Meet the Press College Roundtable.
To the students themselves, this is the dialogue that needs to happen. Right now, this is the type of discussion. We're not ready yet for it. I mean, because the emotion level is there. It's very hard for someone to differentiate the mayor's responsibility to keep buildings from not being burned and people from not being hurt and properties from not being looted. And also as an advocate for racial justice in this country. Right now, people separate the two. It's very hard for them to realize that that's part of your job, and mayors are under the gun. Right. But if we look at this as new models, not using the old models, those partnerships that I'm talking about, looking at policing in a whole different way, understanding that a lot of that can be done through social work better than it can be done through law enforcement. Right. And understand that the whole community has to be a part of it. It's not just write a check and walk away. It is getting involved as a corporate leader, as a labor leader, as a nonprofit leader, as an institution, and not just relying on government to solve it. Then we can have real change happen.
Mr. Mayor, well put. Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
All right, I want to turn now to our student journalists, Sarah Beth, David, Avalon. And Avalon, I'm going to start with you. I thought that was an interesting dialogue there right at the end with the mayor. I think we're going to see some city governance gets transformed a lot over the next decade. And the fact is, I don't think anybody knows what that's going to look like yet. And that's kind of what I took away from the mayor. What did you take away?
Absolutely, I agree. Especially his point about bringing in more people from the community and kind of transforming the ideas that we have of policing right now. It'll be very interesting to see what Pittsburgh looks like in the next couple of years if as he remains mayor, and also just interesting to see these creative partnerships that he was talking about come to fruition.
David, what did you take away?
Well, I think there were a couple things that that really stood out to me. I mean, one of the things that he mentioned is the complexity of this entire thing. It's definitely not an easy situation we're dealing with right now. And the point that I thought was interesting, he talked about philanthropy a little bit. And the key line there was not all cities can do this. And that's true, I think. You know, you look across the country, not all cities have the resources with that philanthropy to really make those changes in order to fund the organizations they want to fund, to kind of take away from the police's responsibility we talked about at the beginning. So a lot of really, intimacy in terms of how we treat these situations. It's not a simple issue. It's very complex.
Sarah Beth, I'll be honest. I think your question to him about the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon in particular, and it really stood out to me, and he didn't have a good answer because, the institutions probably have to answer your question in some way. But Carnegie Mellon, what a great example. He talks about private partnerships. Carnegie Mellon is a monument to the robber barons, right, to the wealthy of over a century ago. Andrew Carnegie, and Andrew Mellon there. And yet it is not serving the public in the way that perhaps the city would like it to serve.
Absolutely. And I think the really interesting thing here is about how this university, he couldn't answer for them, but he can prepare the high school students. So I asked him, where's the failing? And he doesn't have a good answer for that, because ultimately it's not his duty as mayor to prepare college students to make that jump from their associate community college all the way to the four-year colleges. And it's going to be really, really interesting to see what Carnegie Mellon and other universities do to make sure that college is affordable, especially with all of this additional financial burdens and less on-campus jobs for students.
Right. Never mind that universities themselves are feeling the pinch financially as well. So it's an ongoing challenge on every level. What a terrific panel this week. You three were as good as we've had, and we've had some excellent journalists each time. I always love it when the interviewee's a little bit uncomfortable in the right kind of way, and that's what you guys achieved today. So well done. All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you again for another excellent edition of our College Roundtable. We'll be back next week with Meet the Press, College Roundtable edition. Until then, we'll see you. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe, and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.